I still remember the first time my son Daniel brought her home. Her name was Clara, a name that sounded like sunlight, like it belonged to someone gentle. But the girl who walked through my front door that evening was anything but gentle. She was stunning, confident, and sharp in a way that made the air in the room change. Her smile seemed polite, but her eyes scanned my house as if she were taking inventory. I stood in the doorway, drying my hands on a towel, and Daniel, my only child, introduced her with that familiar sparkle in his eyes, the one I hadn't seen since he was little. "Mom, this is Clara," he said, his voice laced with the pride of a man who thought he'd found someone extraordinary. Clara reached out her hand. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Henson," she said. Her tone was smooth, but there was something about it, a subtle edge, like a compliment hiding behind glass. I smiled. "Please call me Margaret." Her lips curved slightly. "Sure, Margaret." She said my name as though she was testing it on her tongue, as if I were part of a past she didn't intend to respect. From that moment, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. Daniel was 27, ambitious, kind, always trying to do right by others. He worked long hours at his firm, and for years it had just been the two of us after my husband Richard began traveling constantly for work. Clara entered our lives like a storm wrapped in perfume and charm. Within weeks, she had Daniel wrapped around her little finger. At first, I tried to be welcoming. I cooked her favorite dishes, asked her about her family, her job, her dreams. But she always kept her answers shallow, vague. When I'd speak about the past, about Daniel's childhood, about how he used to love painting, she'd glance at her phone or sip her wine, visibly disinterested. One evening after dinner, I walked into the living room to find her scrolling on her phone while Daniel cleared the table. I smiled, trying again. "Clara, do you need help finding a job? I know some people who could—" She didn't look up. "Oh, that's sweet, but I don't think I need that kind of help." "That kind?" I asked softly. She finally met my gaze and smiled, that kind of smile that doesn't touch the eyes. "I mean, you're from a different time, Margaret. I'm sure you have your ways, but the world's moved on." "No offense," a lump formed in my throat. Daniel didn't hear it. He was in the kitchen, humming softly as he rinsed plates. Different time, old ways, and that's when she said it. Almost under her breath, but loud enough for me to catch it. "You're old news." She said it like a fact, not an insult, but the sting was real. I froze, holding the tray I'd brought in, my chest tightening in disbelief. Before I could respond, she looked up, pretending she hadn't said anything at all. That night, I lay awake beside Richard. He'd returned home just a day before after one of his frequent business trips. "You're overthinking it," he muttered when I told him about Clara's words. "Young people can be blunt. Don't take it personally." But something in the way he said it, detached, dismissive, unsettled me. It wasn't like him to defend someone he barely knew. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being too sensitive. After all, Daniel was happy. Wasn't that what mattered? But over the next few weeks, I noticed something strange. Whenever Richard was home, Clara changed. Her confidence slipped away. Her posture stiffened. Her laughter, usually loud and easy, became tight and nervous. At first, I thought she was simply intimidated by him. Richard could be imposing, tall, stern, always in control of every situation. But one afternoon, as I came downstairs earlier than expected, I saw something that chilled me. Clara was in the hallway, standing near the front door, whispering into her phone. Her hand trembled slightly. "No, I can't. I can't face him again," she whispered. I froze mid-step, hidden behind the staircase. A pause. Then, her voice cracked. "You don't understand. He knows. Who did she mean?" My stomach dropped. I tried to step back quietly, but the old wooden stair creaked beneath my foot. She looked up sharply, eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. "Margaret," she said, her voice instantly sweet again. "I didn't hear you come down. I was just getting some tea," I said, forcing a smile. "Is everything all right?" She slipped her phone into her bag, her smile tightening. "Of course. Everything's fine." But her hands were shaking, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. That night, as we sat at dinner, Clara barely touched her food. Richard asked her about her new job, his tone casual, but she avoided his gaze, staring at her plate. When Daniel laughed at something on his phone, she flinched at the sound of Richard's voice. My mind raced. What did he know? Why was she afraid of him? The words old news suddenly didn't feel like an insult anymore. They felt like a warning, a misplaced clue to something deeper. And as I watched her hand tremble while reaching for her glass, I realized she wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of my husband. But why? The next few days felt heavy. There was a strange tension in the house. The kind you can't quite explain, but you feel it in your chest in the silence between conversations, in the way people avoid eye contact. Richard was working from home more often, which was unusual. Normally, he thrived on his business trips, on being out in the world, making deals and commanding rooms. Now he seemed restless pacing the study, taking phone calls behind closed doors. Clara, on the other hand, had become distant. She still smiled when Daniel was around, but her smiles didn't last long. I'd catch her staring into space, her brow furrowed, her hands fidgeting with her necklace. Sometimes, when Richard entered the room, she'd quietly excuse herself. It was subtle, but I saw it. I noticed everything. One evening, Daniel and Clara came over for dinner. Richard poured wine for everyone, the soft clink of glasses echoing in the quiet. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she took hers. "Relax, Clara," Richard said, his tone smooth but with something beneath it, something that made my skin crawl. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she forced a laugh. "I'm just tired. Long week," he smiled faintly. "Of course." Then his gaze lingered a second too long. I felt a strange heat rising inside me. Anger? Fear? I couldn't tell. After dinner, I offered Clara a ride home since Daniel had gone out to get something from the store. She hesitated, then nodded, grateful. The car ride was quiet until we reached the old oak road near her apartment. "Clara," I said gently, "I don't mean to pry, but you seem uneasy when you're around Richard. Is something wrong?" Her hands gripped her purse tighter. "It's nothing," she murmured. "Just nerves. Are you sure?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "Because it doesn't look like nerves." She turned to me then, her eyes wide and glistening with something that looked like pain. "You wouldn't believe me even if I told you." "Try me," I whispered. Her lip quivered. He scares me." The words hung in the air like fog. "What do you mean he scares you?" I asked, my heart racing. She shook her head, wiping at her eyes. "I can't, not now. Just, please don't leave me alone with him again." Before I could say another word, she opened the car door and rushed inside her building, leaving me sitting there in the cold, silence pressing against my ears. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words played over and over again. He scares me. I turned toward Richard in bed, his steady breathing filling the room. The same man who had been my husband for 31 years. The man who'd once written me letters while away on business trips, telling me how much he missed home. Could this same man be someone Clara feared? The next morning, after he left for a meeting, I went into his study, something I hadn't done in years. His desk was immaculate, as always. Every paper stacked, every pen aligned. But in the bottom drawer, tucked behind an old file, I found something odd. A manila envelope with a single name written on it in Richard's handwriting. Clara. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were photographs, some old, some recent. In one, Clara stood at a cafe, unaware she was being photographed. In another, she was leaving what looked like her office building. There were at least a dozen of them, each more unsettling than the last. I covered my mouth, the air catching in my throat. Why did my husband have surveillance photos of my son's girlfriend? A creak from the hallway made me jump. I quickly slipped the envelope back into the drawer just as Richard appeared at the door. "What are you doing in here?" His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, too sharp. "I was just looking for the electric bill," I lied, forcing a weak smile. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You shouldn't be snooping, Margaret. You know how I like my things organized." I felt the chill in his voice. The kind that comes when a man isn't angry yet, but something darker is beneath the surface. That evening, Daniel called. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "Clara's acting strange. She won't tell me what's wrong, but she's been crying all day. Did something happen when you dropped her off?" I hesitated. "She just said she was tired, sweetheart. Maybe she's overwhelmed." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie, one I told to protect him, or maybe myself. Later that night, after everyone was asleep, I sat in the dark living room, staring at the old family photos on the wall. My wedding picture caught my eye, me in white lace, Richard in a crisp black suit, his arm around me, smiling for the camera. I'd thought that smile meant safety, love, a shared life. But now, I wasn't sure what it meant anymore. Then I heard a faint buzzing sound coming from Richard's study. I followed the noise, my bare feet silent against the floor. His phone was vibrating on the desk. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. I shouldn't have looked. But I did. The message read, "She knows I'm back. We can't hide it forever." My heart stopped. I scrolled up and saw another message from earlier that week. If she finds out the truth, it's over. My breath hitched as realization began to form a cold, dreadful thought I couldn't yet put into words. The truth. Something they were both hiding from me. As I set the phone down, I caught my reflection in the dark window. My own face looked like a stranger's, frightened, uncertain, yet quietly determined. For the first time, I didn't just feel like a wife or a mother. I felt like someone standing at the edge of something vast and dark, something that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. And I knew. The next step would change everything. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet, heavy with that kind of silence that makes you listen to your own heartbeat. Richard was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow, steady. He looked peaceful, too peaceful for a man carrying whatever secret those messages hinted at. I studied his face for a long time, searching for something familiar, something real. But all I saw was distance. Downstairs, I brewed coffee, my hands trembling as I poured the hot liquid. My mind replayed every detail from the night before: the photos, the messages, Clara's words. None of it made sense, yet it all connected somehow. Like pieces of a puzzle still hidden under the table. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore it anymore. After Daniel left for work, I drove to Clara's apartment. She looked surprised to see me standing at her door, clutching a paper bag filled with muffins, a flimsy disguise for the real reason I was there. "Margaret?" she said softly, her voice hoarse. She looked pale, her eyes red as if she hadn't slept. "I thought you could use some breakfast," I said gently. "May I come in?" She hesitated, glancing behind her, then nodded. The apartment was small, barely furnished. There were papers scattered on the coffee table, resumes, bills, and something that caught my eye: a photograph. It was old and creased, showing a younger Richard, standing beside a teenage girl with brown curls. Clara quickly snatched it from the table. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked down, her knuckles white around the photo. "I told you. You wouldn't believe me." "Try me," I said again, this time firmer. Clara took a shaky breath and sat down. "I didn't know who he was when I met Daniel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not at first. But when I saw a picture of your husband in the house, I almost fainted. My body went cold. Why?" "Because," she said, her eyes filling with tears, "I met him years ago when I was 16. He used a different name then. He helped me get a scholarship through a foundation. Or at least that's what he said." She swallowed hard. "But it wasn't about a scholarship. He made me believe he cared about my future, about helping me. But there were boundaries he crossed that no man should. When I tried to cut contact, he threatened me." My breath caught in my throat. "No," I whispered. "You must be mistaken." "Richard, he wouldn't," she shook her head. "I'm not mistaken. I moved cities to get away. I even changed my last name. When I met Daniel, I never thought—" Her voice broke. "I didn't know he was your son until I came to dinner that first night. When I saw your husband standing there, I wanted to run. I couldn't speak. My entire world tilted, the room spinning slowly. I didn't tell Daniel because I didn't want to ruin him," she continued. "He loves his father, and I thought maybe Richard had changed. But when he saw me again, he started sending messages, reminders. He told me to stay quiet, to play along, that if I said anything, he'd destroy Daniel's career." Clara's words blurred into a hum as tears welled in my eyes. The man I'd built my life with, the man I'd defended for decades, was capable of this? I wanted to deny it. I wanted to scream that she was lying. But the fear in her eyes was too real. The shaking in her hands wasn't an act. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked weakly. "I was afraid," she whispered. "And I didn't think you'd believe me." I stared at her, my heart splitting in two. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure I would have. When I got home, Richard was in his study again. The door was half open. I stood there for a moment, watching him the way his shoulders moved as he typed, calm, unbothered, as though the ground beneath us wasn't about to collapse. "Richard," I said softly. He turned. "You're home early." I stepped closer. "How long have you known Clara?" His fingers froze mid-type. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Why are you asking that?" "Because she told me something today," I said. "Something I need to know if it's true." He looked up then, his expression unreadable. "And what did she tell you?" "That you met her years ago." "That you hurt her?" My voice cracked. "That you threatened her." He leaned back slowly in his chair, studying me. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he smiled a cold, almost pitying smile. "She told you that, did she?" "She's terrified of you, Richard." "I saw it." He stood up, walked around the desk, and stopped just a few feet away. "Margaret," he said softly, almost kindly, "you've always been too trusting. You see good where there isn't any. That girl is manipulating our son. She's trying to tear this family apart." I shook my head, tears spilling down my cheeks. "No, this time I believe her." Something dark flickered across his face, something I'd never seen before. He stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," I whispered. He slammed his hand against the desk, making me flinch. "You know nothing!" he shouted. Then he took a deep breath, smoothing his hair back, regaining his composure. "You're emotional. You're confused. Let me handle this." He turned and walked toward the door, his voice calm again. "And Margaret, stay out of things that don't concern you." The words hit me like a slap. When he left the room, I sank into his chair, trembling. The scent of his cologne clung to the air, but now it made me sick. My phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. It read, "He knows you talked to her. Be careful." My blood ran cold. I looked toward the window. Across the street, a dark car was parked, the same one I'd seen near Clara's apartment. Someone was watching me, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about Clara's fear anymore. It was about survival. The next morning, I woke to a quiet house, though nothing about that quiet felt peaceful anymore. Every shadow seemed to move differently, every sound felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Richard was gone off to the office, or at least that's what the note on the kitchen counter said. His handwriting was calm, steady, elegant as always. But beneath that neat scrawl, I could almost hear his voice. "Stay out of things that don't concern you." I sat down with a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. My hands trembled slightly as I opened my laptop. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, only that I needed to find something that could tell me who my husband really was or who he had been. I started with his company's website, then his travel records, his emails. Nothing out of place. But when I searched his name alongside Scholarship Foundation, something unexpected appeared, an archived article from 12 years ago. The headline read, "Businessman Richard Henson launches Future Leaders Fund for Underprivileged Youth." I clicked it. There he was, smiling in a suit beside a group of young students, one of whom looked hauntingly familiar. A teenage girl with brown curls. Clara, my pulse quickened. I scrolled down, reading every word. The foundation had been short-lived, dissolved after only a year, with no explanation. But there was one detail that made my stomach twist. Richard had personally mentored several of the scholarship recipients, including Clara. I leaned back in my chair, my breath shallow. The story she told wasn't just true, it was documented. For a long time, I just sat there, the sound of the clock ticking too loud in the quiet kitchen. Then I opened a blank document on my computer and began typing everything Clara had told me, everything I had found. I needed to keep a record. If Richard really was watching us, then truth needed a place to live outside of my memory. That afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was tight, anxious. "Mom, what's going on with Clara?" "She's refusing to see me. She said she needs space, but I don't understand why." I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "Daniel, sometimes people have pasts they don't want to share right away." "She said she's scared," he admitted. "Of Dad. I don't get it. What could Dad possibly have done?" I closed my eyes, fighting tears. "Daniel, listen to me carefully. I need you to trust me for a few days, all right? Don't push Clara. Don't confront your father. Promise me, he sighed, confused. Mom, you're scaring me. I know, I whispered. But please just promise. When we hung up, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet resolve I hadn't known I possessed. For years, I had built my life around peace, order, and loyalty. But loyalty to the wrong person is a slow kind of self-destruction. That evening, I went into Richard's study again, this time more deliberate. Every sound felt amplified: the faint creak of the floorboards, the click of the drawer sliding open. Inside, I found more folders, some labeled with initials instead of names. Each one contained similar photographs and notes. My chest tightened as I flipped through them. It wasn't just Clara. There were others. Each file contained the same pattern: a young woman's photo, a brief mentorship summary, and then nothing. No closure. No explanation. As I placed the last folder back, I heard the distant sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart skipped. I closed the drawer, turned off the light, and slipped out just as the front door opened. Margaret? Richard's voice echoed. Are you home? I stepped into the hallway, forcing a smile. Just finishing laundry. He walked toward me, his gaze lingering a moment too long. You've been quiet lately, he said. Everything all right? I nodded. Just tired. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, a gesture that once felt loving, but now made my skin crawl. You know I'd never let anything happen to you, right? I forced a small smile. Of course. That night, after he fell asleep, I copied the files from his study onto a flash drive. My hands shook the entire time, but I didn't stop. When it was done, I hid it inside an old tin in the pantry, behind the baking flour. I had no clear plan, yet just instinct. And instinct told me the truth had to survive, even if I didn't. The next morning, I visited Clara again. When she saw me, she looked terrified. Why are you here? He'll find out. I already know, I said softly, holding up the flash drive. And I believe you, her eyes widened. You, what? I found the files. The photos. You weren't the only one. Tears filled her eyes. Oh, God. Margaret, you have to tell Daniel. He deserves to know who his father is. I shook my head. Not yet. If we do it wrong, Richard will destroy everything. We have to be careful. She nodded slowly, wiping her tears. Then what do we do? I looked out the window, at the same black car parked across the street. We stay quiet, and we wait for him to make a mistake. For the next few days, I played the role I'd perfected over 3 decades: the devoted wife, the steady homemaker, the woman who asked no questions. But underneath that mask, I was watching, listening, collecting, and then late one night, I heard him on the phone again. His voice was low, deliberate. Yes, he said. She suspects. No, she doesn't have proof yet. But if she does, we'll handle it. Handle it. Those 2 words sank deep into my bones. When he hung up, I stepped quietly back to our bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, the weight of every choice pressing against me. I'd spent my life believing that love meant forgiveness. But now, I understood something else. Sometimes love means protection, and sometimes protection means war. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every night, I lay awake listening for Richard's footsteps. Every breath I took carefully measured in the dark. When dawn came, I'd rise before him, hiding the exhaustion behind a practiced smile. In the daylight, I looked ordinary, just another middle-aged woman watering her plants, organizing her pantry, chatting with neighbors. But beneath that quiet exterior, I was living a double life. I'd begun keeping a hidden journal documenting every suspicious movement, every phone call, every time he left unexpectedly. It was terrifying how normal he could appear. The way he'd kiss me on the cheek before heading out, the way he'd compliment my cooking as though he hadn't turned our home into a web of fear. He laughed more often now, that same charming laugh that used to make me love him, but now made my stomach twist. Clara and I stayed in touch, but always carefully. No texts, no calls. Just notes slipped into the hollow of an old oak tree at the park, exchanged when no one was watching. It felt like something out of a spy novel, except this was real, and every move mattered. One day, Clara left a note that read, "He's watching me. Someone followed me from work yesterday. I can't keep living like this." I crumpled the note in my hand, my eyes burning. I knew I couldn't ask her to stay strong any longer. The time for quiet observation was over. That night, after Richard went to bed, I called the only person I thought could help Detective Hayes, an old acquaintance from church who had retired but still had connections. I told him everything, or almost everything. Enough to make him listen. He didn't interrupt, just listened to my trembling voice. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, he said, "Margaret, are you sure you want to open this door? Once you do, there's no closing it." I stared at the photo on the mantel Daniel as a little boy, sitting on Richard's shoulders, both laughing in the sunlight. My voice cracked. "It's already open." We arranged to meet the next morning at the cafe downtown. I hid the flash drive inside a small box of mints and tucked it into my purse. The morning was gray, the kind of colorless day that felt suspended in time. I drove carefully, every car behind me feeling like a threat. I parked a few blocks away just in case. When I arrived, Hayes was already there, older, grayer, but his eyes still sharp. "You've aged well, Margaret," he said quietly, a sad smile touching his face. "I wish I could say the same for my soul," I murmured. We sat in a corner booth, and I handed him the mint box. "Everything's in there. Photos, names, records." He kept it all. He nodded, slipping it discreetly into his jacket. "I'll get this to the right people. But you need to be careful. If he senses something—" "I know," I interrupted softly. "He already suspects me." As we spoke, I noticed a man sitting at the counter tall, wearing a cap pulled low. He wasn't drinking his coffee, just watching. My heart thudded painfully. "Hayes," I whispered. "Behind you." He turned slightly, then looked back at me. "Go home," he said under his breath. "Now." I left quickly, feeling that man's eyes follow me all the way to my car. My hands shook so violently I could barely insert the key. When I got home, the first thing I noticed was that the study door was open. Wide open. Richard was standing inside, holding one of the folders, the one I thought I'd left perfectly in place. He turned slowly as I stepped in, his expression unreadable. "Where did you go this morning?" he asked. My voice came out thin. "The store." He nodded slightly, still watching me. "Funny, I checked your car's GPS. It says you were downtown." My stomach dropped. He'd been tracking me. He walked toward me, his gaze calm but predatory. "You're hiding something, Margaret. And I think I already know what it is." I forced a steady breath. "You're paranoid." He chuckled softly, stepping closer until I could smell his cologne, the same scent that had once meant safety. "No, I'm careful." He paused. "You should have stayed out of it." My hands were trembling, but I didn't back away. "What did you do to her, Richard?" I whispered, his jaw tightened. "That girl ruined everything. She should have kept quiet." It was the first time he'd said anything close to an admission, and I caught it. My phone, hidden inside my pocket, was recording. "Ruin what?" I asked. He stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "My life, my reputation. Everything I built. By telling the truth? By lying about me," he snapped, slamming his hand against the wall. "You think I'd throw it all away for some—" He stopped himself, breathing hard. "You don't know what she is?" I took a step back, shaking my head. "No, Richard. I finally do." The next sound was the click of the front door. Daniel's voice echoed from the hallway. "Mom, Dad?" I froze. Richard's eyes darkened. Before either of us could move, Daniel walked in, confusion written across his face. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Richard said quickly. "Your mother and I were just—" "She's lying to you," I interrupted, my voice trembling but strong. "She's been talking to people? Making up stories?" Daniel looked between us, his brow furrowed. "What stories?" I turned to my son, my voice breaking. "Daniel, listen to me. Clara was one of the girls your father mentored years ago." He hurt her. Stop!" Richard barked. Daniel stepped back, stunned. "Dad, what is she talking about?" "Lies," Richard said, his tone sharp. All lies, but Daniel wasn't convinced. His eyes moved from my tear-streaked face to Richard's clenched jaw. "Why would she lie about this?" The room fell into silence. Richard's phone buzzed again, the same unknown number flashing across the screen. Daniel saw it, and something shifted in his eyes. "You've been hiding something." "Daniel." But before he could finish, Daniel turned and stormed out. Richard called after him, but it was too late. The door slammed, leaving only the echo of his footsteps fading away. I sank into the nearest chair, trembling. Richard stood there, silent, breathing hard. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not of me, of what would come next. The house was unbearably still after Daniel left. Every second stretched longer than the last, filled with a silence that felt like a warning. I could still hear the echo of the front door slamming, the sound replaying in my mind like a bell I couldn't unhear. Richard didn't move for a long time. He stood by the window, his reflection half lit by the gray afternoon light, jaw clenched, breathing heavy. Finally, he spoke. "You shouldn't have done that." His tone was quiet, even too quiet. It chilled me more than if he'd shouted. I straightened in my chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap. "You left me no choice." He turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "You've destroyed everything." "No," I said softly. "You destroyed everything the day you decided to hurt that girl." His expression hardened, but for a split second, I saw something flicker guilt, maybe. Or fear. Then it vanished. He stepped closer. "You think anyone will believe you? After all these years? You have no proof." I looked him straight in the eye. "I have more than you think." The words seemed to catch him off guard. "What does that mean?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. His jaw tightened as realization set in. "You recorded me," he said, his voice dropping. My silence confirmed it. His nostrils flared as he took a step forward. "You have no idea what you've just done." "I know exactly what I've done," I said quietly. "I've stopped pretending." For 31 years, I had played my role: the loving wife, the patient listener, the woman who smoothed over rough edges. But that woman no longer existed. In her place was someone who had finally opened her eyes. Richard's expression darkened. "Where's Daniel?" "Gone," I said. "And I pray he never comes back until this is over." He exhaled sharply, pacing. "You filled his head with lies." "I can fix this. I can fix everything." "Not this," I said. "Not this time." He turned toward me, his composure cracking. "Do you have any idea what you're doing, Margaret? Do you really want to drag our family name through the mud? Over her?" The bitterness in his voice twisted something inside me. "It's not about her anymore. It's about what you did. What you became." He shook his head, almost laughing. "You always were naive. Maybe I was. But I wasn't blind anymore." Before he could speak again, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the tension. Richard glanced toward the window, suspicion clouding his face. Then came the knock firm, deliberate. My heart pounded. I hadn't called Hayes that day, but he'd told me he'd check in soon. Richard walked toward the door, cautious. "Who is it?" "Detective Hayes," came the voice from outside. Calm, professional. "We'd like to ask you a few questions, Mr. Henson." For the first time, Richard's composure faltered completely. His face turned pale, his shoulders stiff. "You called them," he said quietly, without looking at me. I said nothing. He opened the door halfway, his voice clipped. "You have no right to be here without a warrant." Hayes didn't flinch. "We're not here to search. We're here to talk. About your mentorship foundation, and a woman named Clara Winters." Richard froze. The faint sound of another car door closing followed more officers stepping out, standing at a distance. He glanced at me then, his eyes burning with betrayal. "You did this." "I had to," I whispered. "For Daniel. For every girl whose name you buried in those folders." His jaw tightened. "You'll regret this." But I didn't feel regret. I felt something else entirely, a strange calm that settled deep in my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of him. The conversation at the door stretched on, voices low and tense. I couldn't make out every word, but I saw the change in Richard's posture, his confidence unraveling. Hayes was calm, controlled. Richard, on the other hand, was unraveling by the minute. Then, finally, the words came that made my breath hitch. "Mr. Henson, we're placing you under temporary detainment pending further investigation." Richard's eyes darted to me, pure fury in them now. "This isn't over," he hissed as one of the officers stepped closer. "No," I said softly. "It's finally beginning." They led him out in handcuffs, a sight that broke something in me even as it freed me. Because love, even when it dies, leaves ashes. And those ashes burn slow. When the car disappeared down the street, the silence that followed was overwhelming. I stood at the window, my reflection looking back at me, older, heavier, but stronger. Hayes walked back up to the porch, his expression weary. "You did the right thing, Margaret." "Did I?" I whispered. Daniel will hate me, he sighed. Maybe for a while. But one day he'll understand. I nodded, though the words didn't comfort me much. That evening, Daniel finally called. His voice was quiet, tired. Mom, he said, the police came to see me. They told me everything. I waited, bracing myself. I don't know what to feel, he continued. I can't believe this is real. I know, I said softly. Neither can I, he paused. You did the right thing. Tears filled my eyes. I didn't want to hurt you. I know, he said again. But thank you for protecting her. After we hung up, I sat by the window, watching the last traces of daylight fade. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet, truly quiet. No footsteps, no shadows, just stillness. I thought about Clara, how fragile her voice had sounded when she told me the truth, how much courage it must have taken for her to face the man who'd once stolen her peace. And I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who smiled through lies, who mistook silence for safety. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone who had finally chosen truth over comfort, courage over fear, and even though my heart ached for everything I had lost, I also felt something new estrange, fragile freedom blooming in the ruins. The days that followed felt like walking through fog, not quite lost, but not yet found. Every room in the house felt larger without Richard's presence, as if the silence he left behind was taking up space. The first night after his arrest, I barely slept. The bed felt too big, the sheets too cold, but the strangest thing was the absence of fear. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like someone was listening. When morning came, I made coffee the way I always had. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the garden bathe in soft light. The flowers looked the same, but somehow they meant more. Every color seemed louder, every sound sharper. Freedom has a sound. I realized it's quiet, but alive. Daniel came by later that day. His face looked pale, worn, older somehow. When he walked through the door, neither of us spoke right away. He just stood there, eyes scanning the house, his hands buried in his pockets. Feels strange, doesn't it? I said softly. He nodded. Yeah. Then after a pause, they told me what he did. All of it. I set down my mug, my hands trembling slightly. I'm sorry you had to hear it that way. He shook his head. No, I'm glad I know. There was a long silence between us, thick with all the things we couldn't say. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes glistening. Did you know, Mom? Before Clara? My throat tightened. Not really. I think maybe I saw pieces of it. Little things I chose not to question. Why? Because I loved him, I said simply. And because sometimes love blinds you not out of foolishness, but out of hope. Daniel nodded slowly, tears filling his eyes. He wasn't the man I thought he was. No, I said quietly. But you don't have to carry his mistakes. You're not him, Daniel. He looked away, blinking hard. Clara's leaving town, he said finally. She says she needs a fresh start. I felt a pang in my chest, though I understood. She deserves peace, I said softly. She's been living in fear for too long, he nodded. She wanted to thank you for believing her. For everything, I smiled faintly. Tell her she's stronger than she thinks. After Daniel left, the house returned to its gentle stillness. I wandered into the study, Richard's old kingdom, and stood in the center of the room. The desk was empty now, cleared out by the investigators. The shelves, once lined with certificates and photographs, looked bare. For years, this room had been off-limits, sacred, a place where I entered only with permission. Now it was just another room in my house. I opened the window, letting the cool air sweep through. It carried the scent of rain and earth, the smell of cleansing. That night, I pulled out my old journals, the ones I had kept in the early years of my marriage. The pages were filled with dreams, notes of gratitude, silly sketches Daniel had drawn as a child. Then, as the years went on, the entries changed fewer words. More questions, less joy. By the last one, there was only a single sentence written across the page. I hope he still loves me the way he used to. I closed the book slowly, a quiet ache pressing against my heart. The woman who wrote that sentence had been so desperate to keep her family whole that she hadn't noticed the cracks beneath her feet. But she had survived. The next morning, I went to the park where Clara and I had exchanged our secret notes. The old oak stood tall and still, its trunk hollow where fear once lived. I placed one final note inside, not for Clara, but for myself. It read, "You are not old news. You are still here. You are still becoming." I stood there for a while, feeling the wind move through the branches. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing, their voices bright and unburdened. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. Later that week, Daniel called again. "Mom," he said, "Clara's decided to stay. She wants to face things instead of running." My heart softened. "That's brave." "She said she wants to visit you to thank you in person." "Tell her I'd love that," I said with a smile. When she came, she looked different, lighter somehow, though her eyes still held the weight of everything she'd endured. We sat on the porch, sipping tea, the air filled with the faint sound of cicadas. "You didn't have to help me," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," I replied. "Sometimes women like us spend too long believing silence keeps us safe. But silence only feeds the wrong people." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You gave me my life back." I reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "No, Clara, you took it back yourself. I just stood beside you while you remembered how strong you are." She smiled then, a real one this time, soft, warm, honest. It was the kind of smile that comes after storms. When she left, I sat there on the porch until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and lavender. I thought about the phrase she once used, "old news." It had hurt then, those words. They had felt like a dismissal, a cruel reminder of how easily women fade in the background once they've served their part in someone else's story. But now, I understood something deeper. Being old news didn't mean forgotten. It meant experienced. It meant surviving. It meant carrying stories that others hadn't yet lived through, and maybe that was my purpose now, to tell those stories. That night, I opened my laptop and began to write. Not for revenge, not for pity, but for truth, for every woman who'd ever been silenced. As the words filled the screen, I felt the weight inside me begin to lift. I wasn't the same woman who once feared her husband's voice. I wasn't old news. I was a beginning. It's strange how healing rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or sunshine. It slips in quietly, like dawn after a sleepless night, slow, gentle, almost unnoticeable at first. Weeks passed, then months. The trial against Richard gained momentum, and though I avoided most of the courtroom proceedings, I followed every update through Detective Hayes. Each report chipped away at the image I'd once built of him, not just as my husband, but as a man. And yet grief has its own logic. It doesn't care that the person who hurt you deserves it. It still hurts. I mourned him not for the man he was, but for the illusion I'd lived beside for 31 years. The world outside, however, wasn't as forgiving. The whispers began, the kind that float through grocery store aisles and linger in church pews. People who once smiled at me now avoided my eyes. Others, more curious than kind, approached me with hushed voices and pity in their tone. "Margaret, I just can't believe it," they'd say. "He always seemed so respectable." Respectable. That word used to mean everything to me. But now it just sounded hollow. I stopped going out for a while. Instead, I filled my days with simple rituals, baking, reading, tending to my small garden. There was comfort in the ordinary. There was peace and control. Then one afternoon, Clara stopped by. She looked stronger, her shoulders straighter, her eyes brighter. She'd cut her hair short, as if shedding a past that no longer belonged to her. "Hi," she said softly, standing at the door. "I hope it's okay that I came," I smiled. "It's always okay." She stepped inside, glancing around the house that still held shadows of its old life. "Daniel said you've been writing." I nodded. "Just stories. Reflections, mostly." "That's good," she said, smiling faintly. "You should. You have something to say." We sat together at the kitchen table, sipping tea. She told me she'd found work at a local nonprofit one that helps women who've faced abuse and manipulation. "It feels good," she said, "to turn something ugly into something that can help someone else." Her words sank deep into me. Turning pain into purpose. Maybe that was the only real way to heal. When she left, I opened my laptop again. The document I'd started weeks ago was still there, waiting. I began writing, not as a victim, but as a witness to my own life, to the things women endure quietly, to the strength that hides beneath trembling hands. I wrote about the years I lost trying to keep peace, about the red flags I'd brushed aside, about the moment I finally stopped believing silence was love. I didn't spare myself either. I faced the parts of me that had chosen denial over confrontation. The words came like waves, painful. Cleansing, necessary. And with each sentence, I began to understand something. Healing isn't a single moment of forgiveness or revenge. It's a collection of small choices to stand, to speak, to keep breathing even when your lungs are filled with ash. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Richard. It arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, but I knew his handwriting immediately. My hands shook as I opened it. "Margaret," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking. Maybe too late, but I am. You were always stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I hope one day Daniel will see me as a man who lost his way, not as a monster." There was no apology. Not really. Just the echo of a man who couldn't face himself. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Then, without hesitation, I burned it in the fireplace. Some truths don't deserve to linger. That evening, Daniel came by. His face looked calmer now, less haunted. "Clara told me about the nonprofit," he said proudly. "She's amazing." "She is," I agreed. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You should go there, Mom. They're starting a support group for women who've gone through things like this. You'd be good at it." The thought frightened me at first. For so long, I'd hidden behind my own pain, unwilling to stand in it publicly. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized maybe this was my second chance. A week later, I walked into that small community hall, unsure of what to expect. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. About a dozen women sat in a circle, some young, some older, all with stories carved into their eyes. When it was my turn to speak, my voice shook at first. "My name is Margaret," I said softly. And for a long time, I thought silence was strength. I thought forgiveness meant forgetting. But I've learned that real strength is standing up when it hurts. And real forgiveness starts with forgiving yourself. A few heads nodded. Someone across the room began to cry quietly. By the end of the session, the fear that had followed me for months began to loosen its grip. These women didn't look at me with pity or curiosity. They looked at me with understanding, the kind that only comes from surviving your own fire. As I drove home that evening, the sunset painted the sky in hues of deep rose and gold. The radio played softly, an old tune I hadn't heard in years. I smiled to myself, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in so long, not joy exactly, but peace. That night, before bed, I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked older, yes, but there was something else there too, a quiet glow in my eyes, a steadiness in my posture. Old news, I thought. Maybe that's what she'd called me once. But old news, when retold, becomes history, and history has power. The first time I stood in front of an audience to tell my story, my hands trembled so badly that I had to grip the lectern to steady myself. The small community center smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked coats. Rows of chairs filled the room, faces turned toward me, some kind, some curious, all waiting. I wasn't a speaker. I wasn't an activist. I was just a woman who had spent too long being quiet. But that day, I spoke anyway. "I was called old news once," I began, the words slow, steady. And at the time, it felt like an insult, as if my story had lost its worth. But I've learned something since then. Stories don't expire. They evolve. And sometimes they save lives. A soft murmur spread through the crowd, the kind that comes when people lean in not out of gossip, but connection. I told them everything. Not in detail that reopened wounds, but in truth that stitched them closed. I spoke about denial, about the kind of love that becomes survival, and about the danger of mistaking silence for peace. When I finished, there was no applause at first, just stillness. Then slowly a woman in the back stood up. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You said what I've never been brave enough to say." Her voice cracked on the last word, and that's when others began to stand one by one, sharing fragments of their own stories. Pain, betrayal, endurance. It wasn't chaos. It was communion. Afterward, as people came up to thank me, I realized something profound. For the first time, my voice wasn't echoing into emptiness. It was being heard. When I drove home that evening, the world outside looked the same, but I felt different, lighter, as if the weight I'd carried for decades had finally found somewhere else to rest. Daniel called that night. His voice sounded warm, calmer than it had in months. "Clara told me about your talk," he said. "She said the women were really moved." I smiled. "They moved me too," he chuckled softly. "You're becoming famous, Mom." "Not famous," I said gently. "Just free." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm proud of you." Those 4 words, simple, steady, broke me in the best way. I'd spent years trying to protect him from truth, afraid it would destroy him. But instead, it had shaped him. He'd seen pain, but he'd also seen resilience. A few days later, I received an invitation to speak at a women's conference in another city. My instinct was to decline. Who was I, after all, to stand on a stage and talk about strength? But then I remembered that frightened woman I once was standing in her own kitchen, pretending not to hear the quiet screams of her intuition. I owed her this. When I arrived at the conference, the room was larger, brighter. I sat backstage, clutching my speech, breathing slowly. The host introduced me as Margaret Henson, advocate, survivor, and storyteller. The word storyteller made me smile. Once upon a time, I thought stories were something that happened to other people. Now mine was a tool not of pain, but of power. When I stepped onto the stage, I saw hundreds of faces looking back at me. Women, men, young, old. Every one of them carrying something invisible. "Sometimes," I began, "the hardest truth isn't the one others hide from you, it's the one you hide from yourself." I spent years believing that love meant silence, that forgiveness meant pretending nothing happened. But love doesn't silence. Love listens. And forgiveness doesn't erase. It remembers and grows from remembering. I spoke for almost 20 minutes. By the time I finished, the air in the room felt different, softer, heavier, alive with something unspoken. When I stepped off the stage, people reached out to touch my hand, to thank me. Later, in the quiet of my hotel room, I looked out over the city lights and thought of Richard. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't forgive him either, but I'd stopped letting his shadow define my light. I opened my journal and wrote one line. Some stories begin the moment another one ends. When I returned home, Clara came by again. She'd brought Daniel with her, and they both looked at peace in a way that made my heart ache with relief. "You were amazing," Clara said, smiling shyly. Daniel nodded. "She's being modest." They gave her a standing ovation. I laughed, shaking my head. "I wasn't trying to be amazing. I was just telling the truth." Clara's eyes softened. "That's what made it amazing. We spent the evening talking not about the past, but about what came next." Daniel spoke about wanting to start a charity in Clara's name, one that would support victims of manipulation and coercion. I listened quietly, pride swelling inside me. As the night ended and they left, I stood by the door for a while, the cool air brushing against my face. I looked up at the stars, faint but steady. There was something comforting about their persistence. Even after darkness, they found a way to shine. Inside, my phone buzzed with messages people who had heard my story, thanking me for giving voice to what they'd never dared to say. Some were strangers. Some were neighbors. Some were women I'd passed in the grocery store without ever guessing what they carried. Each message felt like a thread, weaving together something bigger than all of us, a tapestry of truth, stitched with courage. That night, before bed, I returned to my mirror, the same one that had reflected years of doubt and fear. Now it showed something else. A woman who had been broken and rebuilt. A woman who had found her voice, and I smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally understood something I'd once missed. Being old news doesn't mean your story is over. It means you've survived long enough to tell it. Autumn arrived quietly that year, the kind that painted the world in muted golds and soft ambers. The air carried a gentle chill, and with it, a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. The leaves fell in slow spirals outside my window as I brewed tea one afternoon. It had been 6 months since the trial ended. Richard was sentenced. The papers covered it for a few weeks, then the world moved on as it always does. People forget. Headlines fade, but healing doesn't follow deadlines. For me, life had changed not in grand ways, but in small ones, the kind you almost don't notice until one day you realize you're breathing differently. Daniel and Clara had moved in together. They visited every Sunday, bringing laughter back into the house like sunlight filtering through the curtains. Clara's laughter, once hesitant and fragile, now rang clear and unburdened. Watching her heal was like watching spring after a long winter, slow, patient, beautiful. One afternoon, as she helped me tend the garden, she paused beside the rose bush Richard had planted years ago. "Do you ever think you'll forgive him?" she asked softly. The question lingered in the air. I looked down at the soil, feeling its coolness between my fingers. "Forgiveness," I said slowly, "isn't about saying what happened was okay. It's about deciding it no longer owns you." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "So, have you?" I smiled faintly. "I think I've forgiven myself. That's enough for now." Later that evening, after they left, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, the last bit of daylight fading behind the trees. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who'd whispered her doubts into empty rooms, who'd pretended not to notice the way her husband's temper chilled the air. That woman had spent her life being quiet. But silence, I'd learned, was never peace. It was a slow kind of drowning. Now my quiet was different. It wasn't the absence of fear. It was the presence of strength. Over the next few months, I began volunteering with the nonprofit Clara worked at. My role was simple: to listen. Sometimes women just needed to talk, to be believed, to not feel crazy for carrying the weight of something no one else could see. One evening, a young woman named Elise sat across from me, twisting her bracelet nervously. She couldn't have been older than 23. Her voice trembled as she spoke about a man who made her feel small, who told her she was nothing without him. As she spoke, I saw pieces of myself in her: the uncertainty, the shame, the desperate need to believe that love could fix what pain had broken. When she finished, she looked at me through tear-filled eyes. "Do you really think it gets better?" I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. "It doesn't just get better," I said gently. "It gets clearer. One day you'll wake up and realize that you were never broken. You were just buried under someone else's fear." She nodded, her shoulders trembling, and for the first time since she walked in, she smiled. That night, when I returned home, I sat at my desk and opened the document I'd been writing, the story that began the day Clara walked into my life. I'd nearly finished it, but as I reread the last few paragraphs, something in me hesitated. The story didn't feel like it belonged to me alone anymore. It belonged to every woman who'd ever been dismissed, silenced, or called old news. So I changed the title. I called it "The Women Who Stayed Silent and Then Spoke." When I was done, I sent the manuscript to a small publisher recommended by someone at the nonprofit. I didn't expect much. Maybe they'd read it, maybe they wouldn't. But 3 weeks later, I received an email. "Your story needs to be heard. We'd like to publish it." I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart thudding softly in my chest. That night, I lit a single candle on the windowsill. It was something I'd started doing, a quiet ritual to remind myself that even in darkness, there's always light. The flame flickered gently, reflecting in the glass. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a memory of the life I once lived, of the woman I once was. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You made it." Weeks later, the first copies of my book arrived in a small brown box. I held one in my hands, running my fingers over the cover. The image was simple, a lone candle in the dark, its flame steady and strong. I sat down, opened to the first page, and read the dedication aloud. For every woman who thought her story was over, it's not. When Daniel came by that evening, he picked up a copy and smiled. "Mom," he said softly, "you did it." "No," I replied, smiling back. "We did." He hugged me, the kind of hug that feels like forgiveness, like closure, like beginning again. As the evening faded into night, we sat together on the porch. Clara joined us, leaning against Daniel's shoulder. The air smelled of jasmine and rain. The world felt quiet, safe, almost tender. I looked up at the stars again, those tiny sparks that refused to go out. Old news. I thought again. Maybe. But some stories deserve to be told again and again, until every woman who's ever been silenced realizes her voice still matters. Until the next generation grows up knowing that strength doesn't always roar sometimes. It simply endures. And as the candlelight flickered beside me, I realized that my story, our story, wasn't one of endings at all. It was one of becoming. The day my book was released was strangely ordinary. The sky was pale blue, the air soft with the smell of freshly cut grass. Birds sang outside my window as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath my feet. I brewed tea, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at the single copy I'd kept for myself. There it was, The Women Who Stayed Silent and Then Spoke printed, bound, real. I traced my name on the cover with trembling fingers. Not because I wanted recognition, but because it reminded me of how far that name had come. When I opened the first page, I read the foreword I'd written only a month earlier. This story began with silence, the kind that weighs on your bones. It ends with a voice that refuses to fade. I closed the book, took a deep breath, and smiled. The publisher had arranged a small launch event at the local library. Nothing grand, just a handful of readers, local journalists, and members from the nonprofit. When I arrived, Clara and Daniel were already there. Clara wore a soft lilac dress, her eyes full of quiet pride. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her back. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said, his smile warm. "Thank you," I whispered, brushing invisible dust off my sleeve. "I still can't believe any of this is real." Clara squeezed my hand. "It's real because you made it real. You gave all of us permission to speak." The event began simply. A few kind words from the host, a round of applause that felt both distant and intimate. Then it was my turn to speak. I stood at the podium, my heart thrumming like it used to before the first words of truth escaped me. "I wrote this book," I began, "because I once believed my story had no value. I believed that pain was something we carried quietly, tucked away where no one could see it. But pain doesn't disappear in silence. It grows roots." I glanced at Clara in the front row. Her eyes were wet, but she smiled. "This book isn't about revenge," I continued softly. "It's about remembrance and the courage it takes to see ourselves clearly. To stop apologizing for surviving." The audience was quiet, leaning in. I could feel their attention like warmth. When I started writing, I said, I thought I was telling one story mine. But I was wrong. I was telling our story because every woman who has been told she's too late, too loud, too emotional, too much, carries a version of this story. When I finished, the room filled with applause, not loud or forced, but deep, sincere, full of understanding. It wasn't celebration. It was solidarity. Afterward, people came up one by one, some to thank me, others to share pieces of themselves. A woman in her 60s held my hand and whispered, "I wish I'd had your courage when I was your age." I smiled softly. "You have it now." A young man approached next. "I read your article in the paper," he said. "I used to think these things didn't happen, not in families like ours. But they do. Thank you for making me listen differently." That moment, more than any applause, told me the story had done its job. The weeks that followed were a blur of emails, letters and interviews, small podcasts, community newsletters, women from all over writing to tell me their stories. Some were brief, just a line or two. Others were pages long, filled with memories they'd carried in silence for years. One letter began, "You don't know me, but your book helped me find the words to leave." Another simply said, "Thank you for proving that old news can still change lives." I kept every letter, tucking them into a wooden box beside my desk. Each one felt like a piece of a mosaic, fragile on its own, but together, something whole, something powerful. One morning, Clara visited with a copy of a national magazine in her hand. "You're in here," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. I laughed, shaking my head. "Oh no, what did they say?" She grinned. "They called you the Quiet Revolution." I blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, her voice softening, "you started something, Margaret. You showed people that healing doesn't always roar sometimes. It whispers and still moves mountains." Her words settled deep in me, warmer than sunlight. That evening, I sat by the window, the same one I used to stare through when I felt trapped. The garden outside swayed gently in the wind, the rose bush now blooming again after years of neglect. I smiled at the sight. Even the things planted in pain can bloom again. Daniel and Clara stopped by later, bringing dinner. The three of us ate together at the table that once held so many heavy silences. Now, laughter filled its corners again. After dinner, Daniel looked at me with that same spark in his eyes that reminded me of his childhood. Mom, he said, Clara and we're getting married. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My hand flew to my mouth as tears welled up. Oh, Daniel, Clara smiled, her own eyes glistening. We wanted to tell you first. Because none of this our healing would have happened without you. I reached across the table, holding both their hands. No, I whispered, smiling through tears. It happened because you both chose love that doesn't hide. We sat there for a long time, no words needed. Just the quiet hum of gratitude between us. Later, after they left, I stepped outside again. The night was cool, the stars bright and scattered. I thought of Richard not with anger, not even sadness anymore, but distance. Like a chapter I'd finished reading. The air carried the faint scent of roses and rain. I whispered into the night. Old news, huh? And for the first time, I laughed not out of irony, but out of freedom, because what she once meant as an insult had become my anthem. Old news meant I had lived. It meant I had endured. It meant I was still here wiser, stronger, unbroken. The morning of Daniel and Clara's wedding arrived with sunlight that felt like a blessing. It poured through my bedroom window, soft and golden, spilling across the white dress I had carefully laid out the night before. I hadn't worn anything that elegant in years, a simple pale blue gown, graceful but unpretentious, the kind of color that felt calm and alive at once. As I fastened the necklace around my neck, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My hair was streaked with silver now, but I didn't try to hide it. It told my story better than words could, every line, every strand, a reminder that I had lived through storms and still found my way to sunlight. For a long time, I simply looked at myself. Not with judgment, not with sadness. With recognition, I was no longer the woman who walked on eggshells in her own home. I was someone new, someone reborn, not through youth, but through truth. The ceremony was held outdoors in a small botanical garden on the edge of town. When I arrived, the scent of jasmine and lavender filled the air, mingling with laughter and quiet music. Clara stood near the archway, her dress flowing like light itself, her smile radiant. Daniel, handsome in his navy suit, stood beside her, steady, proud, finally free. When they saw me, they both walked over. Clara hugged me first, whispering, "I'm so glad you're here." I smiled against her shoulder. I wouldn't miss this for the world. Daniel kissed my cheek. "You look beautiful, Mom," I laughed softly. "It must be the lighting." As the ceremony began, I took my seat in the front row, surrounded by flowers and soft laughter. The officiant spoke about love, not as perfection, but as persistence. About how love is not a promise to never fall, but a vow to always rise again together. When Daniel read his vows, his voice trembled. "Clara," he said, "you taught me that love isn't something you earn. It's something you protect, and I promise to protect you for as long as I live." Clara's eyes glistened. "And you," she said, "taught me that family can be more than the one we're born into. It's the one we build with honesty, with patience, with grace." Her voice cracked on that last word. Grace. Tears slipped down my cheeks quietly. Not of sorrow, of peace. When they exchanged rings, the light shifted, breaking through the canopy of trees. A golden beam fell across their hands, and for a moment, everything else faded. After the ceremony, we gathered for dinner under strings of fairy lights. There was laughter everywhere, the kind that fills empty spaces and makes you believe in second chances. At one point, Daniel raised his glass. "To my mother," he said suddenly, catching me off guard. "Oh, Daniel, don't," I began. But he smiled and continued. "To my mother," he said again, voice steady. "For showing me that love can be quiet and still be strong. For proving that truth, no matter how late it arrives, can still set you free." The guests clinked their glasses, and I couldn't help but laugh through the tears. It wasn't pride I felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude for having lived long enough to see the pain of my past become the soil from which something beautiful grew. Later that night, after the music faded and the guests began to leave, I walked alone through the garden. The air was cool, the moonlight soft and kind. I paused near the arch where Daniel and Clara had said their vows, and for a moment I closed my eyes. In the stillness, memories fluttered like shadows, the trembling hands, the whispered lies, the fear that once wrapped around my heart. But those memories didn't hurt anymore. They were simply part of the landscape of my life. I whispered into the quiet, "You can rest now." And somehow, I knew the younger version of me, the woman who once thought her story had ended in silence, finally could. When I returned home that night, I placed my shoes by the door and sat on the porch, the cool wood beneath my feet grounding me in the present. I could still hear faint echoes of music carried by the wind, laughter, joy, life moving forward. Inside, my book sat on the coffee table beside a small vase of wildflowers Clara had brought me. A letter peeked out from between its pages, one I'd written months ago but never sent. It was addressed to Richard. I unfolded it and read it one last time. "Richard, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't need an answer. I just want you to know that I no longer carry your shadow. You taught me what fear looks like, but you also taught me what strength feels like by forcing me to find mine. I hope one day you understand the damage you caused. But more than that, I hope you understand what it cost you to lose the people who once loved you. Goodbye." I folded the letter again and placed it in the fireplace. As the paper burned, the flames flickered softly, turning the words to ash. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air outside was crisp, the horizon tinged with pink and gold. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The garden was quiet except for the faint hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. I thought of all the women who had written to me, each one carrying her own version of my story. Some were still afraid. Some were healing. Some were still deciding whether to speak. I whispered their names to myself, though I didn't know most of them, because I did know one thing. Every time a woman speaks her truth, she pulls another one out of silence. And maybe that's how healing really happens, not in one great leap, but in 1,000 quiet voices rising together. Weeks later, I received a small package in the mail. Inside was a framed photograph Daniel and Clara on their wedding day, smiling, radiant. Beneath it, a note written in Clara's handwriting read, "For Margaret, who taught us that love without truth isn't love at all." I placed it on the mantel, right where the old wedding photo of Richard and me used to hang. It didn't erase the past, nothing could, but it redefined it. That night, I sat by the window with a candle burning beside me. Outside, the world was asleep, but inside, I felt something blooming. Not joy exactly, something quieter, deeper, peace. I thought about the title Clara once gave me in Anger Old News. I smiled softly. Yes, I was old news. But old news, when remembered, becomes wisdom. Old news becomes testimony. Old news becomes survival, and survival, I realized, is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of everything that follows. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the candle flicker against the walls, warm, alive, steady. Outside, the first fireflies of summer glowed against the dark, tiny lights whispering to the night that even after everything we endure, we rise, we begin again.